I went camping alone in late October, the kind of time when the days feel tired and the nights stretch longer than they should. The place was a state forest I had been to once before, far from main roads, with no cell service and only a thin dirt access trail. I chose it because it was quiet and empty, because I wanted to feel small for a while and let the noise in my head fade out. I told myself I knew what I was doing. I had decent gear, a reliable truck, and enough food for 4 days, even though I planned to stay only 2 nights. The drive had already felt off. The trees were bare, their branches thin and sharp like bones. Leaves covered the road so thick that I could not see the ground beneath them. The air smelled wet and old, like soil that had been turned over too many times. When I parked at the trailhead, the silence was deep, not peaceful, but heavy. No birds, no wind, just my own movements sounding too loud as I stepped out of the truck and shut the door. I hiked in for about an hour with a full pack. The trail was narrow and poorly marked, which I liked at first. It felt private. The forest closed in around me, tall pines mixed with hardwoods, the ground uneven with roots and rocks hidden under leaves. I found a small clearing near a stream, just wide enough for a tent and a fire ring made of old stones. The stream moved slow and dark, making a soft, steady sound that felt calming. I set up camp carefully. I checked the ground for signs of animals, flattened leaves, or anything that looked fresh. I did not see much, just old tracks and broken branches that could have been from storms. I pitched my tent, laid out my sleeping bag, and organized my food in a dry bag. Everything felt normal. The sun dropped faster than I expected, and the light shifted from gold to gray to blue in what felt like minutes. When night came, it came hard. The forest turned into a wall of black shapes. I built a small fire and cooked a simple meal. The fire crackled and popped, the only thing breaking the quiet. I felt watched, but I brushed it off as nerves. Being alone does that. I cleaned up, put out the fire, and zipped myself into the tent. The first night was restless. Every sound felt close. A branch snapping somewhere in the dark made my muscles tense. Leaves rustled, then stopped, then started again. I told myself it was animals, maybe deer or raccoons. The stream kept flowing, steady and dull like breathing. I eventually fell asleep in short stretches. I woke before dawn with my heart racing. I did not know why at first. Then I noticed how quiet it was. Even the stream seemed softer. I lay still listening. Nothing moved. The silence pressed against my ears. After a long time, the normal sounds slowly returned. I laughed quietly at myself and waited for light. The second day was cold and cloudy. I explored a bit, staying close to camp. I noticed something then that I had missed before. There were footprints near the edge of the clearing, not animal prints. They were human, deep in the soft ground, heading toward the stream and then away into thicker woods. They looked recent. My chest tightened, but I tried to stay calm. This was public land. Other people could be around. I spent the day fishing a little, eating, and keeping busy. Still, I could not stop scanning the trees. The forest felt tighter, closer. Around late afternoon, I found more signs. A broken branch at shoulder height. Leaves crushed in a line that did not match any trail. I started packing up earlier than planned, thinking I might leave the next morning at first light. As the sun went down again, the air grew colder than the night before. I skipped a fire this time, not wanting to draw attention. I ate cold food and zipped myself into the tent while there was still some light left. Darkness settled in slow and thick. That night, the sounds were different. Heavier, slower. I heard footsteps, not fast, not careless. They stopped and started, circling wide at first. My breath became shallow. I stayed still, listening so hard my ears hurt. The steps came closer, then paused. I could hear fabric brushing against leaves, the small scrape of a boot on rock. No animal moved like that. Time stretched out. My body felt locked in place. The steps moved around the clearing, then faded. I waited, counted my breaths, trying not to panic. After what felt like hours, I convinced myself whoever was had moved on. I must have drifted off because I woke again to a different sound. Something brushed against my tent. Not hard, just enough to make the thin fabric shift. My heart slammed, so hard it made me dizzy. The brushing moved along the side of the tent. slow and careful. I could see a shadow block out what little moonlight filtered through the trees. I did not move. I did not breathe. The sound stopped near my head. The zipper did not move, but the fabric pressed in slightly, like someone leaning close. I could smell something through the tent wall. Sweat and dirt. Human. Then it pulled away. The footsteps retreated, slow and unhurried. I stayed frozen long after the sounds were gone. I knew then I was not imagining things. Someone knew I was there. Someone had come close enough to touch my shelter. I waited until the sky began to lighten. My body felt hollow, like all the strength had drained out of it. As soon as I could see well enough, I grabbed my pack and shoved everything inside without caring about order. I left things behind. I did not care. I just needed distance. I hiked out fast, almost running, every sense stretched thin. The forest looked different in daylight, but not safer. Every shadow felt like a hiding place. When I reached the trailhead and saw my truck, relief hit me so hard my legs shook. At home later that day, I cleaned the dirt off my gear and tried to calm down. A few days later, I saw a local news report about a man arrested in that same forest area. He had been living out there for weeks, moving between campsites, watching people stealing food and supplies. They said he had knives, rope, and notebooks filled with details about strangers. I never went back to that place. I still camp, but never alone and never that far from others. I learned that the woods do not need anything unreal to be dangerous. Sometimes the worst thing out there is just another person, quiet and patient, waiting in the dark. I went camping alone because I wanted quiet. Not the peaceful kind you see in pictures, but real quiet, the kind where there's nothing around to distract your mind. I picked a random spot deep inside a forest area that allowed camping but rarely had visitors. No cabins nearby, no marked trails close to my spot, and no cell service once you went far enough in. That was exactly what I wanted. I parked my car at the last gravel turnout before the dirt road ended. From there, I carried my gear on my back for about an hour. The forest was thick, mostly tall pine trees mixed with old oaks. The ground was uneven and soft, covered in dead leaves and needles that muffled every step. It was late afternoon when I found a small clearing. It looked untouched, like no one had camped there in a long time. No fire rings, no trash, no footprints. That should have been my first warning, but I ignored it. I set up my tent slowly and carefully. I checked the ground for rocks and roots before placing it. I made sure everything was tight and secure. I laid out my sleeping bag, headlamp, and knife inside. I hung my food bag on a tree far from the tent like I was supposed to. The whole time, the forest felt strangely still. No birds, no bugs, just the sound of wind brushing the treetops far above me. It felt like the woods were holding their breath. As the sun started going down, the temperature dropped fast. Shadows stretched between the trees, and the light turned gray and dull. I cooked a simple meal on my small stove and ate it standing up. I kept looking around without really knowing why. I had camped many times before, but something about this place made my skin feel tight, like I was being watched. I told myself it was just my imagination reacting to the silence. When night fully settled in, the darkness felt heavy. My headlamp light barely reached past the nearest trees. Everything beyond that was just black. I crawled into my tent early because there was nothing else to do. Lying there, I could hear my own breathing louder than it should have been. Every small sound stood out. Leaves shifting, a branch snapping far away, something moving through the undergrowth, slow and steady. At first, I thought it was just an animal. Deer, maybe, or a raccoon. I tried to relax. I focused on the sound of the wind, but the movement didn't fade. It got closer. I could tell by the way the leaves were being pressed down instead of lightly brushed. Whatever it was had weight. It moved with purpose, not panic. The sound stopped suddenly, right at the edge of the clearing. The silence afterward was worse than the noise. I lay there, frozen, listening as hard as I could. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. I started to think maybe it had wandered off. Then I heard footsteps. They were slow and careful, circling the tent, not stumbling like an animal, not quick. Each step was placed deliberately. I could hear the ground crunch softly under the weight. I held my breath, trying to make myself as quiet as possible. The footsteps stopped right next to my tent. I could sense something standing there, not touching the tent, just there. I waited for the sound of breathing, but there was none. That terrified me more than anything. Whoever or whatever was outside knew how to stay silent. After a long time, the footsteps moved away. I didn't sleep after that. I just lay there until the sky began to lighten. At dawn, the forest came back to life. Birds started calling, insects buzzed, and the normal sounds returned. I felt foolish for being so scared. I told myself I would pack up and leave after breakfast. I stepped out of the tent and immediately noticed footprints around my campsite. Not animal tracks, clear boot prints, large ones. They circled my tent multiple times. Some were so close they nearly touched the fabric. My stomach dropped. I followed the tracks with my eyes and saw they led deeper into the woods, not toward any trail or road. I packed up fast. I didn't eat. I didn't take my time. I just wanted to leave. As I started walking back toward my car, I felt the same sensation from the night before. That pressure on my back, that feeling of being watched. I stopped and listened. I heard footsteps behind me, matching my pace. When I walked faster, they did too. When I stopped, they stopped. I didn't turn around. I kept walking, my legs burning, my breath uneven. Branches cracked behind me. Leaves shifted. The sounds were always just far enough away that I couldn't see anything. My mind raced with every possibility. A hunter, a drifter, someone who lived out here and didn't want to be found. None of the possibilities made me feel better. The forest seemed longer on the way back. The path twisted more than I remembered. The light dimmed again as clouds rolled in, and the trees blocked what little sunlight remained. I stumbled once and almost fell. When I caught myself, I heard the footsteps pause, like whoever was following me was watching to see if I would get back up. I forced myself to keep moving. Eventually, I saw the gravel road ahead. Relief washed over me, so strong it made me dizzy. The footsteps behind me stopped. I reached my car and threw my gear inside without organizing anything. Before getting in, I looked back at the tree line. Someone was standing there, not close enough to see clearly, but close enough to know it was a person. Tall, still, watching me. They didn't move. They didn't wave. They didn't step forward. They just stood there between the trees, half hidden by shadows. I got into my car and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so badly, I dropped my keys once before getting the engine started. When I drove away, I checked the rearview mirror until the forest disappeared behind a bend in the road. I didn't report it. I didn't tell anyone at the time. I tried to forget it, but I still think about those footprints, the careful steps, and the way that person stood there at the end, silent and patient. I realized something on that drive home that still sticks with me. That place wasn't empty. It never was. And whoever was out there knew exactly where I was the entire time. I was camping during early fall, the time of year when days still feel warm enough to trick you, but nights turn sharp and unforgiving. I chose a spot I'd marked on a map weeks earlier, deep enough into public land that casual hikers wouldn't wander through, but still legal to camp. The trail wasn't hard, just long. Leaves covered most of it, hiding the packed dirt underneath, forcing me to watch my footing the entire way. The forest smelled dry and cold at the same time, like dying plants and damp soil mixed together. By the time I reached my chosen spot, the sun was already dipping low. The campsite sat in a shallow depression surrounded by tall trees, their branches high enough that very little light reached the ground. I picked it because it was sheltered from wind and invisible from any distance. No trail passed nearby, no water source close enough to draw people in. It felt private, which was exactly what I wanted. I took my time setting up the tent, checking the ground carefully before staking anything down. The soil was firm, covered in a thick layer of leaves that crunched under my boots. No fresh footprints, no trash, no fire rings. The place looked unused, which I took as a good sign. I cooked a quick meal as the light faded and packed everything away neatly. Food sealed, gear organized, nothing left out. As darkness settled in, the temperature dropped fast. The kind of cold that creeps in instead of rushing, sinking into your hands and face before you realize it's happening. I layered up and crawled into my sleeping bag, zipped fully inside the tent, and lay on my side facing the wall. The fabric was inches from my face, glowing faintly from starlight filtering through the trees. The forest grew quiet in a way that didn't feel natural. Not peaceful, empty. No wind in the branches. No insects. No distant animals calling out. Just silence and the soft sound of my own breathing. I remember thinking how still everything felt, like the world had paused. Exhaustion eventually took over. My eyes closed without effort. Sleep came heavy and fast. I don't know how long I was out when the sound woke me. At first, it didn't make sense. My brain struggled to place it, hovering between sleep and awareness. Then it registered clearly enough that my eyes snapped open. Fabric sliding. Slow. Careful. The zipper. It was moving downward. I froze instantly. Every muscle locked up like my body knew before my mind fully caught up. I didn't turn my head. I didn't shift my weight. I didn't even breathe deeply. The sound was unmistakable, the soft rasp of metal teeth separating under steady pressure. Not rushed, not clumsy. Whoever was doing it knew exactly what they were touching. The zipper moved only a few inches before stopping. Silence returned, heavier than before. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard it hurt. I waited, staring at the tent wall inches from my face, expecting the sound to continue. Expecting the zipper to open further. Expecting a hand to push inside. Nothing happened. Seconds dragged into minutes. My ears strained for any sound at all. I could hear blood rushing in my head. My hands tingled from staying clenched for too long. I felt exposed in a way I never had before, sealed inside thin fabric that offered no real protection. Then I heard footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, moving backward away from the tent. Leaves crunched softly under careful steps. Whoever was didn't turn and walk away normally. They backed off, increasing the distance inch by inch, like they didn't want to turn their back on the tent just yet. The sound faded gradually, swallowed by the trees. I stayed exactly where I was. I didn't check the zipper. I didn't reach for my light. I didn't move my legs even as they began to cramp. I stayed locked in place, staring at the same spot, convinced that any movement would draw them back. Sleep never returned. Time stretched into something shapeless and cruel. Every small sound made my stomach drop. A branch shifting somewhere far away. Leaves settling as the temperature dropped. Wind finally brushing the tops of the trees hours later. Each noise felt like it could be footsteps returning. When the sky finally began to lighten, I almost didn't believe it. Pale gray light seeped through the tent fabric, softening the shadows. I waited longer than necessary, listening carefully, making sure nothing was moving nearby. Only then did I reach out and touch the zipper. It was exactly where I remembered it stopping. Partially open, not an inch more, not an inch less. I unzipped the rest quickly and stepped outside. Cold air hit me immediately. The forest looked unchanged, quiet and still. But the ground told a different story. Clear boot prints led straight to the front of my tent. Heavy, deep, worn soles. They stopped right where the zipper had been touched. Then they turned around. No circling, no hesitation, no wandering. The prints went straight back the way they came, disappearing into the trees in a clean line. I stood there for a long time, scanning the forest, trying to understand what I was seeing. There were no other tracks, no signs of another campsite, no indication that anyone had been nearby for any reason other than me. I packed up fast. I didn't bother making breakfast. I didn't care about doing things neatly. My hands shook as I worked, and I kept looking up, half expecting to see someone watching from between the trees. I never did. The hike out felt longer than the hike in. Every sound behind me made my shoulders tense. I stopped often to listen, heart pounding, convinced I would hear footsteps matching mine. The forest felt different now. Smaller, closer, less forgiving. When I finally reached my car, relief hit me so hard I had to sit down for a moment before unlocking the door. I didn't feel safe until I was driving, putting distance between myself and that place. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was damaged. No threats were left behind. And that's what stays with me. Whoever it was didn't rush. They didn't panic. They didn't make mistakes. They approached my tent directly, touched the zipper slowly, then chose to stop. They backed away with control, leaving behind proof that they had been there and that they could have gone further. That wasn't curiosity. It wasn't confusion. It was a decision. I don't camp alone anymore. I don't camp in places that are too quiet, too hidden, too untouched. I learned that night that danger doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it moves slowly, carefully, testing boundaries and leaving just enough evidence behind to make sure you understand how close it came. The zipper never moved again. It didn't need to. The message was already clear. I camped alone because I trusted routine more than people. I had done it dozens of times before, always following the same habits. I planned carefully, picked legal spots, checked maps, and avoided popular trails. The place I chose this time sat deep inside a managed forest, far enough from trailheads that casual hikers wouldn't wander in by accident. Camping was allowed, but only a few people ever bothered to go that far. The hiking took most of the afternoon. The trail narrowed the farther I went, eventually breaking into faint bends through grass and fallen leaves. Orange and brown covered the ground in thick layers, hiding rocks and roots. Every step required attention. The forest felt old, quiet, and heavy, like it hadn't changed much in a long time. I chose a small clearing surrounded by tall trees. No water nearby, no obvious landmarks, nothing that would draw attention. The ground was level enough for a tent, and there were no signs of recent camping. No footprints, no fire ring, no trash. That mattered to me. It meant privacy. I set up slowly, checking the area more than once. I circled the clearing, scanning between the trees, listening. Everything felt normal. The kind of quiet you expect when you're far from roads and people. Birds calling in the distance. Wind high in the branches. Nothing close. As evening came, the light drained out of the forest quickly. Shadows stacked on top of each other, filling the space between trees. The air cooled fast, the kind of cold that sinks into your fingers before you realize it's happening. I cooked, ate, cleaned up, and packed everything away. No fire, no extra light. I wanted to stay unnoticed. I crawled in my tent and zipped it fully closed. The fabric felt thin but familiar. I lay on my side, listening to the forest settle. Leaves shifted, branches creaked. Somewhere far off, something moved through brush, but it never came closer. Sleep came slowly but deeply. I don't know how much time passed before I woke up, but it was sudden. No gradual stirring. 1 second asleep, the next fully aware. The tent was glowing. Not bright, but filled with a dim, pale light that hadn't been there before. At first, my half-asleep mind tried to explain it away. Moonlight. Maybe clouds had moved. But the light wasn't even. It wasn't soft or wide. It was focused, and it was moving. The glow slid slowly across the tent wall, rising and lowering slightly, like someone adjusting their aim. My stomach tightened. I held still, barely breathing, watching the fabric inches from my face. Then the light stopped. It settled in one place, pointed directly at my tent. Not sweeping, not searching, fixed. It came from higher than eye level. That detail hit me hard. The angle was wrong for someone standing close to the ground. The beam came from several feet up, cutting through branches, steady and controlled. A headlamp. Someone was standing in the trees, far enough away that I couldn't hear them, close enough that the light reached me clearly. They weren't walking. They weren't shifting. They weren't adjusting their stance. They were just watching. Time stretched thin. My heart hammered so hard it felt like it vibrated the tent floor. I didn't reach for my headlamp. I didn't move my hands. I didn't shift my legs. I stayed exactly where I was, eyes open, staring at the glowing fabric. The beam never wavered. No footsteps, no coughing, no rustling of leaves. Whoever it was knew how to stand still, knew how to wait. Minutes passed, long enough that fear turned into something heavier, more controlled. The kind of fear that settles deep and cold. I became aware of every small sensation. The fabric brushing my cheek when I breathed, the stiffness in my neck, the slow ache in my legs from not moving. Then, without warning, the light clicked off. Not faded, not lowered. Clicked. Total darkness returned instantly. I stayed frozen, listening for movement. I expected footsteps retreating, branches snapping, leaves crunching. Nothing came. The forest returned to its earlier quiet, like the light had never been there at all. I didn't sleep again. I lay there until my muscles ached, replaying the angle of the light over and over in my mind. Whoever had been there wasn't wandering. They hadn't stumbled into my camp by mistake. They had approached quietly, chosen a spot with cover, and aimed the light deliberately. When the sky finally began to lighten, it felt unreal. Pale gray filtered through the tent, softening the darkness. I waited longer than necessary before unzipping the door. I listened carefully, scanning for any sound before exposing myself. Cold air rushed in when I stepped out. The clearing looked untouched. No disturbed leaves, no broken branches, no footprints near the tent at all. That alone felt wrong. Anyone close enough to shine a headlamp like that should have left something behind. I walked slowly toward the tree line where the light had come from. I scanned the ground carefully. Still nothing. No tracks. No signs of movement. It was like no one had ever stood there. Then I saw them. One set of footprints, faint but clear, leading away from the trees at an angle that didn't match any trail. Heavy boots. Deep heel marks. They didn't come toward my tent. They led away from it. I followed them carefully, watching where I stepped so I didn't disturb them. The prints moved straight into thick brush, where branches grew close together and the ground dropped slightly. No path, no reason to go that way unless you already knew it. The footprints didn't wander. They didn't pause. They moved with confidence, pushing deep into the undergrowth until I couldn't follow without forcing my way through. I stopped there. The realization settled slowly, sinking in piece by piece. Whoever it was hadn't walked around my camp. They hadn't circled me. They hadn't come close enough to leave tracks. They'd stayed back, used light instead of movement, then left without ever stepping into my space. They didn't want to be found. They wanted to see me. I packed up immediately. I didn't eat. I didn't sit down. My hands shook as I worked, and I kept looking toward the brush where the footprints disappeared. Nothing moved. The forest stayed quiet. The hike out felt longer than the hike in. Every sound behind me made my shoulders tighten. I stopped often, listening, convinced I would hear footsteps following the same careful pace I had heard nothing of the night before. I didn't. When I reached my car, relief hit me hard enough to make my knees weak. I sat there for a long time before starting the engine, replaying the moment the light clicked off in my head. Nothing was taken. Nothing was damaged. No attempt was made to enter my tent. And that is what made it worse. Whoever it was had control. They chose distance. They chose timing. They chose to leave without being seen, leaving behind just enough evidence to confirm it had been real. I don't camp alone anymore. Not deep in the woods. Not away from trails. Not where someone can stand in the dark, higher than eye level, and watch without ever stepping close enough to be noticed. That night didn't end with a chase or a confrontation. It ended with understanding. I had never been alone out there. I had just been the only one sleeping. I decided to go camping alone because I needed to get away from everything. Work had been exhausting, my sleep schedule was a mess, and my head felt constantly full. I wanted a place where there was no signal, no noise from cars, no people walking past. I picked a random public forest area that allowed dispersed camping. It wasn't popular, and that made it perfect. I didn't tell many people exactly where I was going. I just packed my gear, filled my tank, and left early in the morning. The drive took several hours. The paved road slowly turned into cracked asphalt, then gravel, then dirt. Trees closed in tighter the farther I went. The forest looked old, like it had been growing without interruption for a long time. The air felt cooler, even though it was summer. When I finally parked my car, there was no other vehicle in sight. No trash, no signs of recent activity. It felt like I had stepped into a place people forgot about. I hiked for over an hour carrying my backpack. The ground was uneven and damp. Fallen branches crunched under my boots. Every now and then I noticed trees with old scars, deep cuts that looked too straight to be natural. I told myself they were probably old trail marks or logging signs from years ago. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that this forest had a history I didn't know. I found a small clearing near a shallow stream and decided to set up camp there. The water moved slowly and made a soft, steady sound that felt calming at first. I set up my tent, checked my gear, and laid everything out carefully. I always liked having things in order when camping alone. It made me feel more in control. I noticed the ground had no footprints, not even animal tracks near the water. That was strange, but I brushed it off. The afternoon passed quietly. The sky stayed cloudy, and the light felt dull even when it should have been bright. The forest was quiet in a way that felt wrong. There were no birds calling, no insects buzzing, just wind moving through leaves now and then. I tried to relax, but my body stayed tense. I kept catching myself stopping what I was doing just to listen. As evening came, the temperature dropped fast. I cooked a simple meal and ate quickly. I didn't feel like lingering outside. The trees around the clearing looked darker than they should have, like they were closing in. Shadows stacked on top of each other until everything beyond the fireless campsite blended into one dark wall. I went in my tent earlier than planned. Inside, the sounds felt louder. The stream, the wind, my own movements. I lay there staring at the tent ceiling, trying to calm my breathing. My mind kept replaying small details from earlier. The lack of tracks, the silence, the scars on the trees. Sometime after full darkness, I heard movement. At first it was far away, a slow rustling sound, like something moving through brush without trying to be quiet. I assumed it was an animal, deer, or maybe a bear passing through. I stayed still, listening. The sound didn't fade. It got closer. Then it stopped. The silence that followed felt heavy, like pressure in my ears. I waited for the sound to start again, but instead I heard footsteps. Clear, slow steps on dirt and leaves. They didn't sound rushed or confused. They sounded controlled. Whoever or whatever was moved around the edge of my camp in a wide circle. I lay completely still. I didn't reach for my headlamp. I didn't check outside. I was afraid that any movement would make it clear I was awake. The steps paused near the tent, close enough that I could feel the vibration through the ground. The fabric of the tent shifted slightly, like something brushed against it. Not hard, just enough to let me know it was there. Minutes passed. My legs cramped from staying tense. My heart beat so hard I was sure it could be heard outside. Eventually, the steps moved away, slow and steady, disappearing back into the forest. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed awake until my eyes burned and the sky finally began to lighten. Morning brought some relief, but not much. The forest looked normal again, but the feeling stayed. When I stepped out of the tent, I saw fresh footprints around my camp. Large boot prints. They circled the tent several times. Some prints were so deep that whoever made them had been standing still for a while. I felt sick. I packed everything as fast as I could. I didn't organize my gear. I didn't check the area again. I just wanted to leave. When I started walking back toward my car, the forest felt different. The trees seemed closer together. The path didn't feel as clear as it had the day before. After about 10 minutes of walking, I heard footsteps behind me. They weren't close, but they were steady. Every step I took was matched by one behind me. I tried slowing down. The steps slowed too. I sped up. They did the same. I didn't turn around. I was afraid of what I might see, but I was more afraid of confirming that I wasn't imagining it. The sound followed me for a long time. Sometimes it faded, but it always came back. Branches snapped. Leaves shifted. Once I heard something heavy drag across the ground for a second before lifting again. My arms ached from gripping my backpack straps too hard. The walk back felt much longer than it should have been. The light dimmed as clouds thickened above the trees. My throat felt dry, and my legs shook from tension more than exhaustion. I focused on putting one foot in front of the other, refusing to stop no matter how badly I wanted to. When I finally saw the gravel road ahead, relief hit me hard. I nearly stumbled from it. The footsteps behind me stopped. I reached my car and threw my pack into the back seat. Before getting in, I looked toward the tree line. Someone was standing there, partially hidden by trees. I couldn't see their face clearly, but I could tell they were watching me. They didn't move. They didn't come closer. They just stood there, completely still, like they had all the time in the world. I got into my car and locked the doors immediately. My hands shook as I started the engine. I didn't take my eyes off the forest until I pulled onto the road and drove away. I never went back to that place. I didn't post about it or tell stories for attention. I just kept it to myself for a long time. What scared me the most wasn't that someone followed me. It was how calm they were about it. Like they knew the forest better than I ever could. Like they knew I was the one passing through, and I was never really alone out there. That trip changed how I see quiet places. Some silence isn't peaceful. Some places are quiet because you're not meant to stay there for long. I set up my tent deep inside a forest reserve where camping was legal but uncommon. It wasn't advertised, and there were no neat campsites or signs pointing the way in. The kind of place you only find if you study maps and are willing to walk farther than most people want to. The hiking took most of the day. The trail faded in and out, sometimes clear enough to follow, sometimes barely more than disturbed ground and bent grass. I checked my compass often, not because I was lost, but because the forest made it easy to doubt yourself. The farther I went, the quieter it became. Not the peaceful kind of quiet people talk about, but a hollow quiet like the sound had been drained out of the air. My pack felt heavier than it should have, straps biting into my shoulders. I passed no one, no fresh footprints, no broken branches that looked recent, that should have made me feel safer, but instead it made the place feel unused, like it wasn't meant for people anymore. By the time I found a flat area suitable for a tent, the sun was already starting to lower. The light filtered through the trees in thin beams, turning everything dull and gray. I walked slow circles around the clearing before committing to it, checking the ground, the trees, the undergrowth. Nothing stood out. No trash, no fire rings, no signs of anyone else being there recently. That convinced me to stay. I pitched my tent close to a cluster of thick trees, not right in the open. I like having cover, liked feeling hidden even though I was alone. The ground was damp but firm. The air smelled like wet soil and old leaves. Somewhere far off, something moved through the brush, but it faded quickly and didn't return. I cooked a simple meal and ate it standing up, mostly because sitting down felt wrong for reasons I couldn't explain. The forest grew darker faster than I expected. Shadows stretched long and uneven. The temperature dropped steadily, creeping into my clothes. I put the rest of my food away and left my backpack a few feet from the tent, where I could reach it easily if needed. Exhaustion caught up with me all at once. My legs ached. My shoulders burned. The quiet pressed in, but it didn't stop me from crawling into the tent and falling asleep faster than I usually ever do. I don't remember dreaming. I remember blackness and weight. I woke suddenly. At first, I didn't know why. My eyes snapped open, but everything looked the same. Darkness. The faint outline of tent walls. Then I heard it, breathing. It was right outside the tent. Slow, controlled, even. Each breath drawn in through the nose, released through the mouth. Not rushed, not strained. Too steady to be an animal. Too calm. It stayed there just beyond the thin fabric, close enough that I could hear the air move. My body locked up. Every muscle went tight. I didn't move my hands. I didn't shift my legs. I didn't even swallow. My heart hammered so hard it felt like it would shake the tent, but the breathing didn't change. Whoever was out there didn't react to it. That scared me more than anything. The breathing continued for a long time. Long enough that my fear shifted into something heavier. It felt deliberate, like waiting. I could smell the forest mixed with something else faint and sour, like old clothes that hadn't dried properly. The tent fabric moved slightly as air shifted, but there was no touch, no brushing, just presence. I wanted to check. I wanted to shine my headlamp through the fabric. I wanted to run. I did none of it. Some instinct deeper than thought told me not to move, not to acknowledge it. Eventually, the breathing stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It felt like pressure, like the air itself was holding still. I waited, counting seconds without realizing it, expecting something else to happen. Then I heard footsteps, slow steps through leaves, moving away from the tent. Not crashing, not hurried. Whoever it was walked like they had all the time in the world. The sound faded deeper into the forest until there was nothing again. I didn't sleep after that. I lay there until my body went numb, staring at the same dark spot on the tent ceiling. Every small sound made my chest tighten. A branch shifting, leaves settling, wind brushing the trees far away. None of it felt distant anymore. When the sky finally began to lighten, it felt unreal, like I had imagined the entire night. Pale gray light seeped through the fabric. I waited longer than necessary, listening before unzipping the tent. Cold air rushed in. The forest looked unchanged at first. Still, empty, quiet. Then I saw my backpack. It was closer to the tent than I had left it. Not dragged, not tipped over, just repositioned, sitting upright less than a foot from the entrance. I knew exactly where I had put it the night before. I always did. It had been several feet away, far enough that I'd have to lean out to grab it. Nothing was missing. Zippers closed, straps untouched, no damage. Whoever moved it had been careful. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The ground around it showed faint disturbances, compressed leaves, slight impressions, enough to tell me it hadn't moved on its own. I walked the edge of the clearing slowly, scanning the ground. There were footprints, but they were faint and broken, like the person had been careful where they stepped. Heavy boots, worn soles. They didn't wander. They came straight to my camp, then left the same way. I packed up immediately. I didn't eat. I didn't sit down. My hands shook as I worked, making everything take longer than it should have. I kept turning, scanning the trees, expecting to see someone watching from a distance. I never did, but the feeling of being observed didn't fade. The hike out felt longer and harder. Every sound behind me made my stomach drop. I stopped often to listen, holding my breath, straining to hear footsteps that never came. The forest felt tighter now, less open, like it was closing ranks behind me. When I finally reached the edge of the reserve, the tension drained out of me all at once. My legs felt weak. My head throbbed. I didn't feel safe until I was miles away. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was damaged. No threats were made. And that is exactly why it stays with me. Whoever had stood outside my tent in the dark, listening to me breathe. They had stayed long enough to know I was asleep or pretending to be. They had moved my backpack closer, not to take it, but to touch my space, to show me they could. That wasn't curiosity. It wasn't desperation. It was control. I don't camp in places like that anymore. Not deep reserves. Not areas without clear trails or regular visitors. I learned that isolation doesn't just mean you're alone. Sometimes it means there's no one around to interrupt someone else's choices. That night ended without violence, without a chase, without injury. But the message was clear enough. Someone had been there. Someone had decided how close was close enough. And I left knowing that the worst thing they could have done wasn't taking something from me. It was letting me go, fully aware that they had been inches away while I slept, and that I would never know who they were or why they chose to stop. I camped alone near a remote lake that took most of a day to reach. The hiking was long and slow, the kind that wears your legs down little by little instead of all at once. The trail faded out about an hour before the lake, turning into nothing more than broken ground and scattered animal paths. I liked that. I wanted somewhere that didn't feel touched. No signs nailed to trees. No fire rings stacked with stones. No trash buried under leaves. I wanted a place that felt forgotten. The lake sat low in a bowl of trees, dark and still, almost black even in daylight. It wasn't large, but it felt deep. The shoreline was uneven and muddy, with fallen logs half sunk into the water. The trees leaned inward, as if they were trying to hide it. There was no wind when I arrived. No insects buzzing, just the sound of my boots on dirt and my pack shifting with every step. I walked the perimeter slowly before choosing a spot. No footprints, no broken branches that looked fresh, no signs of recent campers. That alone should have been a warning, but at the time it felt like a reward. I set my tent back from the water, close to the tree line. I had camped near lakes before and knew how rough the wind could get at night. Trees offered cover, and I liked having something solid at my back. Setting up felt normal. Boring even. I pitched the tent, staked it down, and checked it twice. I hung my food bag high and far enough away that nothing could reach it easily. I filtered water from the lake, watching ripples spread outward and fade. The surface went flat again almost instantly, like the lake didn't want to be disturbed. As the sun started to drop, the temperature fell with it. Fast. The warmth drained from the air, leaving everything sharp and thin. I put on a heavier layer and cooked a simple meal. I remember noticing how quiet it had become. Not peaceful quiet, empty quiet. No birds settling in for the night. No insects waking up. Just stillness. The lake stopped moving entirely. No ripples. No sound. It looked solid from a distance, like dark glass. I cleaned up, packed everything away, and crawled into my tent earlier than usual. The cold seeped in from the ground, even through my pad. I zipped the tent all the way shut and lay on my back, staring up at the fabric. My breathing sounded too loud in my ears. I slowed it down without thinking, like I was trying not to be heard. Sleep didn't come easily. Every small sound pulled my attention back. A branch shifting somewhere far away. Something brushing against leaves. The trees creaked as they cooled. Time stretched out. My thoughts drifted, then snapped back again. Around midnight, I heard movement. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't careless. It was slow and steady. The sound of something moving through dry leaves on purpose. The steps weren't heavy, but they weren't light either. Whoever or whatever was knew where it was placing each foot. The sound came from the direction of the trees, not the lake. It moved closer, then stopped. Silence pressed in again, thicker than before. I held my breath without realizing it. Then the movement started again, closer now, circling, leaves crunching softly. A pause. Another step. It moved with patience. It stopped directly beside my tent. I lay there frozen, my muscles tight, my heart beating hard enough that I worried it would give me away. The tent felt suddenly thin, useless. I could smell the cold earth through the fabric, mixed with something else faint and sour that I couldn't place. Then the fabric near my feet pressed inward. It wasn't a quick poke. It wasn't a jab. It was steady pressure, like a hand resting there, testing. The tent wall bowed in and stayed that way. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. The pressure stayed for several seconds. Long enough for my legs to start shaking. Long enough for my mind to run through every bad outcome. Then it slowly lifted away. Footsteps moved again, circling the tent. They stopped near my head. I felt the slightest movement of air, like someone leaning close. The fabric shifted just enough to tell me something was there. Watching, listening. The steps moved away, then came back to the side. Another pause. No sound except my heartbeat and the faint rustle of leaves settling. Then the footsteps retreated, slow and controlled, fading back into the trees. Nothing else happened that night. I didn't sleep. I stayed exactly where I was, staring at the same spot on the tent's ceiling until my eyes burned. My body felt locked in place. Every time the fabric moved from a breeze or a branch falling far away, my stomach clenched. When the sky finally began to lighten, it felt unreal, like time had skipped forward without me. I waited longer, until I could clearly see the outlines of trees through the tent fabric. Only then did I unzip it. Cold air rushed in. The campsite looked wrong immediately. The ground around my tent was torn up, leaves crushed down into the dirt. Clear boot prints circled the tent. Deep, heavy, deliberate. They weren't random. They weren't from someone passing through. Whoever made them had walked around my tent slowly more than once. Near my feet, the tent fabric was stretched inward, marked with dirt where the pressure had been. The shape was clear enough to tell it wasn't an accident. There were no other tracks, no signs of another camp, no trail leading in or out that I could see. Just the prints and the quiet lake sitting there like it had watched everything happen. I packed up immediately. I didn't eat. I didn't sit down. My hands shook as I worked, and I kept turning around, expecting to see someone step out from behind a tree. The forest felt closer now, tighter, like it was closing in. Before leaving, I walked to the water's edge one last time. The surface was still, just like the night before. I couldn't see the bottom, even near the shore. The cold coming off, it felt different from the cold in the air, heavier somehow. The hike out felt longer than the hike in. Every sound made me flinch. I stopped often to listen, to look behind me. I never saw anyone, but the feeling of being followed didn't leave until I was miles away. When I reached my car, relief hit me hard enough to make me dizzy. I sat there for a long time before driving, hands on the wheel, trying to calm down. I don't tell this story to scare people. I tell it because it changed how I see places like that. Remote doesn't mean safe. Quiet doesn't mean empty. Someone knew that lake better than I did. Someone knew how to move through those woods without leaving much behind. They got close enough to touch my shelter, to test it, to let me know they were there. I left with nothing taken and no injuries, but that doesn't make it harmless. It makes it worse. I never camp near water alone anymore. Not lakes, not rivers, not even streams. Places like that draw people in for the same reasons they drew me. They promise calm. They promise isolation. And sometimes they offer something else entirely. Something patient enough to wait until the world goes quiet before letting you know you're not alone. I found the campsite late in the afternoon, deep enough in the woods that the trail had faded into little more than memory. I had been hiking for hours, following a route I had marked on a map months earlier. It wasn't a popular area. Camping was allowed, but only the kind of people who wanted distance ever came this far. That was why I chose it. The forest felt old. Tall trees spaced unevenly, their bark rough and dark with age. The ground was soft underfoot, layered with years of fallen leaves. Everything smelled like damp earth and rot. There were no recent footprints on the path behind me, and no sound ahead. Just my boots and my breathing. That was when I saw it. At first, I thought I was imagining things. A circle of stones, half buried and blackened. An old fire ring. A broken folding chair lying on its side. One leg bent at an odd angle. A torn tarp tangled in low branches, shredded by time and weather. It looked like something left behind years ago, forgotten and reclaimed by the woods. I stepped closer and studied it. The stones were sunk deep into the dirt. Ash stained the soil beneath them, but it looked old, gray, and cold. The chair fabric was faded and brittle. The tarp was stiff and cracked, edges frayed. No food wrappers, no fresh trash, no smell of smoke. Everything about it suggested abandonment. I felt relieved. Finding an old site meant flat ground, already cleared. Less work, less disturbance. I told myself it was safe enough. Whoever had camped there was long gone. The forest had already started to take it back. I set my tent about 30 yards away, close enough to use the clearing, but far enough that I didn't feel like I was intruding. I chose a spot between two thick trees, where the ground dipped slightly and blocked the wind. As I worked, I kept glancing at the old campsite, but nothing changed. It stayed still, quiet dead. Evening came slowly. Light filtered through the trees in dull yellow beams. The temperature dropped, and the forest grew quiet. Not completely silent, but muted, like the sound had been wrapped in cloth. I cooked a simple meal and ate it standing up, watching the shadows stretch. I remember thinking how strange it was that no animals had messed with the old site. No scattered trash, no chewed fabric, but I pushed the thought away. Maybe the place was just too far out for anything curious to bother with. When night fell, I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut. The air was cold, pressing in through the thin fabric. I lay on my back, listening. The woods made their usual sound at first. Leaves shifting, a distant crack as a branch fell. Somewhere far off, something moved through brush. Then I heard it, metal clinking. It came from the direction of the old campsite. A soft, hollow sound, like someone nudging a pot or a can. It stopped, then started again, slow and careful, followed by the faint rustle of fabric. I stayed still, listening. Animals mess with things all the time. Raccoons, rodents, wind catching loose material. I told myself that was all it was. But the sounds didn't match. They weren't frantic. They weren't random. There was a pause between movements, like whoever or whatever it was choosing what to touch next. The fabric rustled again. Then something heavier shifted. The chair maybe. A dull scrape against the ground. My heart beat faster. I held my breath, straining to hear more. The sounds continued for several minutes, then faded. Silence returned, thicker than before. I didn't sleep well. Every time I started to drift off, some small sound pulled me back. I kept thinking I would hear footsteps approaching my tent. I didn't, but the feeling of being too close to something I didn't understand never went away. When morning came, I unzipped the tent slowly. Cold air rushed in. The forest looked the same at first glance, quiet and still. Sunlight filtered through the trees, lighting patches of ground unevenly. Then I looked at the old campsite. The chair was upright, not propped by a branch, not leaning, standing fully open, facing the fire ring. The tarp was no longer tangled in the branches. It had been folded neatly and placed on the ground beside the stones. The fire ring held fresh ash, darker than before, with bits of partially burned wood resting on top. I stood there, frozen, staring at it. The ground around the fire ring was disturbed, leaves pushed aside, dirt exposed. Clear boot prints led in and out of the area, not scattered, not wandering, purposeful. My stomach dropped. I walked closer, my steps slow and careful. The ash was still dry, but it hadn't been there the day before. I knew it hadn't. The smell of smoke lingered faintly in the air, just enough to notice if you were looking for it. Nothing was missing from my camp. Nothing had been touched. Whoever had been there hadn't come near my tent at all. That was the part that scared me most. They had come back to their site in the dark. They had cleaned it up. They had made a fire. And they had done it quietly, close enough that I could hear it, but far enough away that they never crossed into my space. They had known I was there. I packed up immediately. I didn't eat. I didn't sit down. My hand shook as I broke down the tent and stuffed it into my pack. I kept glancing toward the old campsite, half expecting someone to step out from behind a tree and confront me. No one did. As I left, I followed the boot prints for a short distance out of curiosity I couldn't control. They led deeper into the woods, not toward any trail I knew. After a while, they disappeared into leaf cover, like the forest swallowed them. The hike out felt wrong. The woods seemed closer, heavier. Every sound made me tense. I didn't stop until I was far away from that clearing. I don't know who owned that campsite. I don't know how long they had been using it, or how often they left and came back. I only know that it wasn't abandoned. It had been waiting. I had mistaken quiet for empty and decay for neglect. I had set my tent next to someone else's place in the woods without ever realizing it. They came back that night, took care of their things, and left again without letting themselves be seen. They didn't scare me away on purpose. They didn't confront me. They didn't touch my gear. They simply let me understand, in the clearest way possible, that I had chosen the wrong place to sleep, and that the woods I thought were empty already belonged to someone else. I camped off trail in a dense pine forest because I wanted distance from everything familiar. I had studied the map carefully and picked a section of public land that sat far from marked paths. Camping was legal there, but most people didn't bother. The terrain was thick, the trees close together, and the ground uneven. It wasn't inviting, and that was exactly why I chose it. The hiking was slow and tiring. Pines crowded in from all sides, their trunks tall and straight, blocking most of the sky. The forest floor was layered with needles so thick they muted my footsteps. The air smelled sharp and dry, mixed with cold earth. I kept checking behind me, even though there was no reason to. The place felt sealed off, like once you entered, the outside world stayed behind. I finally found a small open pocket where the ground dipped slightly. It wasn't a clearing, just a place where the trees grew a little farther apart. No trail ran nearby. No signs of recent camping. No trash, no fire ring, no broken branches. I stood there for a long time listening before deciding to stay. I set my tent between two thick pines, making sure it was level and well staked. I chose the spot carefully, turning the entrance toward a wall of trees instead of open space. It felt safer that way, even though I couldn't explain why. I left my pack just inside the tent, boots beside it. Everything neat, everything controlled. As evening settled in, the light faded quickly. Pines block sunlight even during the day, and at night they swallow it completely. The temperature dropped fast, the cold sliding in without warning. I cooked a small meal, ate standing up, and cleaned up immediately. I didn't make a fire. I didn't want smoke or light carrying through the trees. The forest grew quiet, but not naturally so. There were no insects buzzing, no wind moving the branches. The pines stood still, tall and unmoving, their needles absorbing sound. The silence felt thick, like pressure against my ears. I crawled in my tent early and zipped it shut. The fabric rustled loudly in the stillness. I lay on my back, staring up, listening to my own breathing. I told myself the quiet meant I was alone. Sleep came eventually, but it wasn't deep. Sometime after midnight, I woke up because something felt wrong. I didn't hear anything at first, just the sense that I wasn't alone anymore. My eyes opened in the dark, heart already beating faster. Then I heard it. Footsteps. They were slow and steady, crunching softly against pine needles. Not close enough to touch the tent, but close enough to circle it. The steps moved around me in a smooth arc, keeping the same distance the entire time. They completed a loop, then another. Same pace, same rhythm. Each step placed carefully, never rushed, never uneven. Whoever was didn't stumble or stop. They didn't cough or clear their throat. There was no talking, no muttering, no heavy breathing. Just walking. I lay frozen, barely breathing. I didn't move my hands. I didn't reach for anything. I stared at the dark tent ceiling, counting steps without meaning to. Every time the footsteps passed the front of the tent, my chest tightened. Every time they moved behind me, my stomach dropped. They kept circling, over and over. Minutes passed, then more. My legs went numb from staying still. My jaw ached from clenching it. The sound never changed. The distance never changed. The pace never slowed. This wasn't someone wandering by. This wasn't someone unsure of where they were. Whoever it was had chosen a path and stuck to it with precision. They knew exactly how far they wanted to be from me. At one point, I considered yelling. I considered turning on my headlamp. I considered unzipping the tent and running. Every instinct screamed not to. Something about the control in those footsteps told me movement would be a mistake. So I stayed still. The circling continued for over an hour, long enough that fear turned into something heavier and colder. Long enough that my body started to hurt from staying tense. Long enough that the sound stopped feeling loud and started feeling inevitable, like it might never end. Then, without warning, it stopped. No fading, no last step, just silence. I waited. Seconds passed, then minutes. My ears strained for any sound at all. I expected the footsteps to start again, closer this time. They didn't. I didn't sleep again. I lay there until the dark slowly thinned and gray light filtered through the tent. My body felt weak and shaky, like I had run a long distance without rest. When daylight finally came, I unzipped the tent slowly. Cold air rushed in. The forest looked normal at first glance. Still, quiet, empty. Then I looked down. A clear path had been pressed into the ground around my tent. Pine needles crushed flat into the dirt, forming a perfect loop. The circle was even, measured, consistent. No breaks, no wandering steps. Whoever had walked there had followed the exact same line every time. They never stepped closer. They never stepped farther away. I stood there staring, my stomach twisting. I followed the circle with my eyes, walking it slowly. The ground was packed down hard, proof of how many times they had gone around. No footprints led toward the tent. No prints crossed the circle. It was a boundary. I searched for tracks leading in or out. There were a few faint impressions farther back, but the pine needles hid most of it. Whatever direction they came from, they left quietly, without disturbing much. That realization hit me harder than anything else. They had walked around me all night. They hadn't tried to open the tent. They hadn't touched my gear. They hadn't said a word. They had simply stayed close enough to let me hear them, close enough to make sure I knew they were there, and far enough away to stay in control. I packed up shaking. I didn't eat. I didn't sit down. My hands fumbled with the tent poles, my breath uneven. I kept looking up, scanning between the trees, convinced I would see someone standing there watching. No one was there. The hike out felt endless. Every sound behind me made my shoulders tense. I didn't stop until I reached a marked trail, and even then, I didn't slow down. Nothing was taken. Nothing was damaged. No threat was made. But I understood exactly what had happened. Someone had found my camp. Someone had decided to stay. Someone had walked around me for hours, marking space, testing boundaries, seeing how long I would stay quiet. They didn't need to come closer. The circle was enough. I don't camp off trail anymore. Not in dense forests. Not where sound gets swallowed and movement disappears. I learned that night that sometimes the scariest thing isn't being approached. It's being deliberately kept exactly where you are while someone else decides when to leave. I went camping alone because I needed to get away from people, not because I wanted danger. I picked a stretch of public land that allowed dispersed camping, the kind of place where you don't get a numbered site or reservation. You park, hike, and choose your own spot. I had been there once before years ago, but not this deep. This time I wanted real isolation. The hike-in took most of the afternoon. The trail started clear enough, then slowly faded into something less defined. By the time I left it completely, I was navigating by terrain instead of path. Fallen trees, thick brush, uneven ground. The forest was mixed hardwood and pine, dense enough that light barely reached the ground. The air smelled damp and cold even though it wasn't late yet. I found a small clearing tucked between trees, barely visible unless you were already standing in it. The ground was flat enough for a tent, and there were no signs of recent use. No footprints, no trash, no fire ring. That mattered to me. I wanted a place that felt untouched. Setting up camp felt normal, familiar. I pitched my tent, checked the stakes, and organized my gear. I hung my food bag farther away than usual, just to be safe. Everything felt routine, and that made me relax more than I should have. I cooked a quick meal and ate it while standing, scanning the trees without really realizing I was doing it. As evening settled in, the forest changed. The temperature dropped fast, like someone had opened a door somewhere and let the cold pour in. The light faded quicker than I expected, shadows filling the spaces between trees until everything looked closer and tighter. Sound started to disappear instead of increase. No insects, no birds, just the faint creak of wood as trees shifted in the cooling air. I crawled into my tent early, zipped it shut, and lay on my side facing the wall. My sleeping bag felt colder than it should have. I listened to my own breathing until it slowed. Sleep came in short stretches, broken by nothing specific, just the feeling that something wasn't right. I woke up sometime in the night because the forest had changed again. At first, I couldn't place it. Then I realized what was missing. Sound. Even the small background noises were gone. No wind, no distant movement, just silence, so complete it felt like pressure on my ears. Then I heard it. Something dragged across the ground. It wasn't loud, just a slow scraping sound, followed by a pause. Then it happened again. It wasn't close enough to touch the tent, but it wasn't far either. The sound moved, stopped, then moved again like someone adjusting something heavy. I stayed still, listening. My heart started beating faster, but I kept my breathing shallow. Animals drag things sometimes. Branches, logs. I told myself that over and over. But the sound didn't fit. It was controlled, intentional. After several minutes, it stopped. I waited. My body felt tight, like every muscle was braced for something else to happen. Nothing did. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me back into sleep, shallow and uneasy. I woke again later to footsteps, slow ones. They weren't crashing through brush or snapping branches. They moved carefully, circling wide at first, then closer. Leaves crunched softly underfoot. Each step was placed with purpose. Whoever it was didn't stumble or hesitate. The step stopped. I felt it more than heard it. Someone was standing near my tent, close enough that the air felt different, like pressure shifting. I stared at the fabric inches from my face, waiting for it to move. It didn't. Minutes passed. My legs went numb. My hands tingled. I didn't dare move. I didn't reach for my light. I didn't check the zipper. Every instinct told me not to acknowledge the presence outside. Eventually, the footsteps moved again. Slow steps retreating, the sound fading back into the trees. No rush, no panic. I didn't sleep after that. I lay there until the darkness thinned into gray. When I finally unzipped the tent, the cold air hit me hard. The forest looked normal at first glance, quiet and empty. But the ground told a different story. My backpack had been moved. I knew exactly where I'd left it, a few feet from the tent under a tree. Now it sat closer, upright, placed neatly near the entrance. Nothing was missing, Zippers closed, straps untouched. Whoever moved it had been careful. My stomach dropped. I stepped out fully and looked around. There were marks in the leaves, faint but clear. Boot prints, heavy ones. They didn't wander. They led straight to my camp, circled once, then moved off in a direct line deeper into the woods. I followed them a short distance before stopping. They disappeared in a thick brush where no trail existed. Branches bent aside, not broken. Whoever it was knew how to move through the forest without leaving much behind. I packed up immediately. I didn't eat. I didn't sit down. My hands shook as I broke down the tent and stuffed everything into my pack. I kept looking up, scanning the trees, expecting to see someone watching. No one was there. The hike out felt wrong. The forest felt closer now, less open. Every sound behind me made my shoulders tense. I stopped often to listen, holding my breath. I never heard footsteps following, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. Halfway out, I noticed something else. Scratches on tree trunks. Not animal claw marks. Too high, too straight, like someone had dragged something sharp along the bark while walking. They followed the same direction as the footprints I had seen earlier. I didn't stop to examine them closely. I didn't want to know more. When I finally reached my car, relief hit me so hard I had to sit down for a moment before unlocking the door. I didn't feel safe until I was driving, putting distance between myself and that place. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was damaged. No threats were made. And that's what stays with me. Whoever it was didn't rush. They didn't make noise by accident. They didn't panic when they realized I was there. They moved my gear, stood near my tent, and left without ever letting themselves be seen. They wanted me to know they had been there. I don't camp alone anymore. Not deep in the woods. Not off trail. Not in places that feel too quiet, too untouched. I learned that night that isolation doesn't just mean peace. Sometimes it means no one else is around to notice when someone decides to step into your space and then walk away, knowing you'll never forget how close they were.